I actually don't usually do introductions, but I felt compelled today to do it for our visitors, and I 100% use ChatGPT for this. So this is my first ChatGPT based introduction, and so I'm very curious about how it did. Okay, so you're gonna have to critique the introduction as best you can. So it is my pleasure to introduce first Dr. James Antony, an assistant professor of psychology and child development at Cal Poly. Dr. Antony earned his PhD in neuroscience from Northwestern University, completed a prestigious fellowship at Princeton, and worked at UC Davis before joining Cal Poly. How's it doing so far? All right. All right, and I'm not going to check anymore. I'm just going to dive right in. His research focuses on one big question. I'd probably say many there, but how do our memories stick around? He studies how memories change over time, why some fade while others grow stronger, and how factors like sleep, surprise, and connections between events shape what we remember. To do this, he uses an impressive mix of tools from EEG, neuroimaging to eye tracking and computational modeling. Dr. Antony's work has been featured in leading journals, including Nature Neuroscience, Science, and eLife, and has earned him honors such as being named a rising star by the Association for Psychological Science. In the classroom, he's known for bringing the science of memory to life with energy and enthusiasm. Apparently, I think you got into your rate your professor. I think you got into your rate your professor profile. All right. I'm also excited to introduce Dr. Kelly Bennion, as Associate Professor of Psychology and Child Development at Cal Poly. She earned her PhD in cognitive neuroscience at Boston College and holds a Master of Education in Mind, Brain, and Education from Harvard. Dr. Benyon's research delves into how real-life experiences like emotion, stress, and physiological arousal affect memory, and especially how sleep helps consolidate those memories. She uses a combination of tools from behavioral tasks and eye tracking to polysomnography and neuroimaging to unravel how our minds decide what to remember. Dr. Benyon's work has been featured in leading journals, including Cerebral Cortex, Nature Human Behavior, and Cognitive, Affective, and Behavioral Neuroscience, and has earned her recognition for her contributions to understanding how sleep, stress, and emotion shape memory. In the classroom, she's known for her clarity, compassion, and ability to make complex neuroscience accessible and engaging. But Dr. Benyon's impact doesn't stop there. She's deeply invested in mentoring and inclusion. She runs Cal Poly's Beacon Research Mentoring Program, which supports underrepresented students through hands-on research and professional development. She's also Associate Director of the University Honors Program and even served as Interim Associate Dean for Diversity and Curriculum. Did I? All right. All right. So, well, round of applause to both of them. I think I was pointing the camera at my chest for most of that, so you might just, it looks okay. It looks okay. So, yeah, so just so you can present to our Zoom audience, which is a bit larger.
Great.
Um,
Maybe I'll look to make sure the camera's pointed
I can
really
see-
quickly.
Really hard to
Oh.
see the mouse.
Tilt it like that.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay.
Okay, great. All right. Wonderful. Well,
Actually, you want to check the Zoom world computer? I think,
Sure.
yeah, I saw some applause.
okay, great. Can everyone hear on Zoom?
Yes, I can hear.
Let's see.
Yep. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
wonderful. Oh, great. And now I have the Zoom window up. Okay.
So we're going to do the research part first, and anyone who doesn't feel like the second part is applicable to them is welcome to leave. Yeah, Callie's going to start.
Great. All right. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for being here. And Elizabeth, I know you're on vacation, so I'm sorry that we cut into that a little bit, but we were so excited to be back in the Boston area. I did my PhD here with Dr. Elizabeth Kensinger at Boston College, and we were doing a week-long visit. So we were really delighted to get to come and share a little bit with you, both about the research that we've been doing in our lab. So Dr. Antony and I jointly run the BAM lab. You can see our logo in the bottom right corner, the Bennion and Antony Memory Lab at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. And we'll largely be talking about the work that we've done there jointly. And then following this, we'll have a professional development session that, we have slides prepared, but we're also happy to make it as interactive, or, we can jump around in our slides if there are specific things that you want to focus on more than others. But we thought it would hopefully be of interest to talk about faculty careers at primarily undergraduate institutions, or PUIs, and kind of what to expect when you're looking for those jobs, how to make you competitive, and then also how to run an active research lab if that's a big priority of yours, like it is with ours. So again, thank you so much for having us here, and we're delighted to share with you this research portion first on making memories last and the many factors that promote memory persistence. So to start us off today, sorry, it's actually not switching to the next slide. Um, yeah, no. Okay, that's okay. I can just click this way. All right, so it's really wonderful being back here in Boston. We've highlighted just some of our prior experiences here. These first few are namely mine. So this is a lab gathering in Elizabeth Kensinger's lab in the summer of 2012. She was really wonderful about bringing the lab together and just making it a place not only for professional development, but also a lot of camaraderie and personal development and friendships. Also highlighted, this is a picture from my master's degree 3 years before I got my PhD, but unfortunately I didn't walk for that one. Additionally, this is a cake. So those of you who may know Elizabeth well probably know that she has many, many talents. So I was really fortunate to get to come back to the lab in summer 2017, a year after I finished my PhD, and was surprised with this absolutely beautiful poster in the form of a cake. But if you read all of the sections, they all make perfect sense, as you might expect they would from Elizabeth. Additionally, Boston is a big city of sports, so I've shared here a trip to Gillette Stadium with James and I, and then this is a photo from the CNS Gala when CNS was in Boston, I believe, in 2018. So it's really nice to be back. But what many of us might be focused on, and what we're especially focused on, are how these experiences are represented in the brain. And unfortunately, while each of these experiences were rich and vivid in the moment, you might note that most of our experiences indeed fade a little bit over time. And of course, over the course of a lifetime, forgetting is ultimately the rule and remembering is the exception. So our big question today is, what makes memories endure? So in some cases, it might be the relationship between the events, like the many amazing events that we had in the Kensinger lab. Maybe each individual one doesn't stick quite as well, but certainly combined, and just the overall picture and sentiments persist. And then in other cases, it might be the sheer surprise of things, like being surprised with a cake, or of course, the emotion that you might remember a graduation with, for example. So, in order to study memories like this, researchers, including ourselves, are often faced with this dilemma of, do we maintain this maximal level of experimental control, or do we go more towards the real world generalizability side of things? And, both James and I began our careers really focused on how repetition and reactivation of simple associations will aid their long-term memory. So in this case, we'll focus on episodic memories as depicted on the left side of this screen here. So early on, we studied how sleep and memory reactivation, just looking at those processes. And I've included just some citations here, but, how does reactivating memories during sleep lead to their long-term retention? Later on, there were some studies on the testing effect. So I think one of the funny things here is the testing effect was my earliest interest in memory prior to my PhD, even back to undergrad. But it's something that James has continued in quite a bit. He's actually read my undergraduate thesis front to back. But has continued on that work largely on his own. And then also James has done a number of studies related to the spacing effect, and specifically looking at a computational model of the spacing effect, specifically looking at the profound effects and long-term benefits of distributing learning over time. So, of course, as many of us know, an absolutely tremendous amount has been learned about memory by studying these simple associations. And we still do some of this work because it has real utility. And that's what we'll begin our talk with today. But of course, as we all know, memories are not formed in a vacuum. And specifically, we know that real life memories are embedded in this really dense, interconnected network of associations. So, we might have emotion playing a role, factors such as sleep, a variety of other things that can happen during consolidation, and just, the many things that make memories messy. So certainly tackling this unconstrained space is a challenge, but we believe that we have the computational tools to do so, and it's something that we've focused on in our lab really steadily over the past few years in order to really better understand our real life and real world memory. So as far as what we'll talk about today, so we'll begin today mostly focused on associative memory. It's a really amazing study that we have done for so long in our lab and have very meaningfully involved undergrads. And that's something too that we hope to speak with you in the later portion of today's session. But specifically, we are going to cover an associative memory study, which challenges some old results a little bit by embracing the importance of integrated networks. And then we'll continue building up our complexity and real world generalizability from there. So to introduce this first experiment, imagine that a novice bartender is learning how to mix cocktails. So first, a bartender might learn that a Manhattan contains sweet vermouth. But then they learn that a martini contains dry vermouth. So these memories, as we know, are not necessarily independent. So the bartender first might find that learning to make the martini has actually retroactively affected their memory of the Manhattan. Or they might find that learning how to make the Manhattan actually proactively affects their memory of the martini. And what this first study looked at was how these relationships might impact the facilitation or the interference between the memories relative to if only one cocktail was being learned. And here we're doing all of this with word pairs. So, our central questions for this first study are: how does relatedness between prior and new memories affect their long term fate? So, specifically, when do two memories facilitate versus interfere with each other? And does this depend on the similarity between those memories? And then additionally, when do their fates become intertwined versus remain independent from one another? And I want to highlight that we'll talk both about some retroactive experiments and proactive experiments. And none of this work could have been done with a really incredible team of undergraduates. So you'll see here the 6 images on the left. These are all former undergraduate students who were akin to our lab managers or research coordinators on these studies. Besides them, we also had tens of undergraduates actually doing the data collection who are not pictured on this slide. And then we also did this work in collaboration with Robert Hawkins, who's at Stanford University, and Chris Walheim at UNC Greensboro. So our inspiration from this study actually came way back from Charles Osgood in a paper published in 1949, which is actually when both of my parents were born, so long time ago. But he had this really incredible insight that I'll just read here, where the classic statement is that the greater the similarity, the greater the interference. But Osgood points out this really interesting paradox here that when carried to its logical conclusions, however, this law leads to an impossible state of affairs. So when the cue and the target are identical, the greatest facilitation, which essentially is ordinary learning, is obtained. Ordinary learning then is at once the theoretical condition for maximal interference, but obviously the practical condition for maximal facilitation. And this is the paradox that he really highlights here. So what we decided to do, now with greater tools and a big army of students to help us collect data, and we'll note that we actually had 200 students in each of the studies that I'll describe here. So it was quite high powered, but we will test this theory. So first we'll highlight the retroactive experiment. So what we did here was we had participants learn a series of word pairs, and they did all of this during Zoom. Some of it was during the pandemic, so we had to pivot to an online format. And essentially what we were interested in was the base pair learning. So we had participants learn these unrelated word pairs like tank maple, plaza doze, cream force. And then depending on the condition, whether it's delta target, delta Q, or the control condition, they then learned a second list of word pairs, which we're calling the supplemental pair learning, or list 2. So in the delta target condition, you can see that the second word of the pair has changed. In the delta Q condition, you can see that the first word of the pair has changed. And in the control condition, they don't see a pair in that second list. So in other words, they didn't see a word related to either cream or force. And what participants were doing was first, they just learned these series of word pairs to criterion. So kind of similar to flashcards, they would view them all, and then they were tested on a cued recall test. So if you see the word tank, type in the word that was paired with it. And then once they got them all correct, they could move on to the next list. So they did that for list 1 and list 2. Then they came back after exactly 48 hours to test via cued recall, first on the base pairs and then on the supplemental pairs. And underlying this, there were systematic relationships between the original cue and the new cue, and the original target and the new target. And these relationships varied according to their global vector similarity, or glove values. So all of these glove values ranged from, or the relationships ranged from truly unrelated, such as croak top, which had a glove value of negative 0.12, to very highly related, such as the pair how what, which had a glove value of 0.08, or sorry, of 0.87. I'll just note we also had another experiment using a narrower range of relatedness, and you'll see that plotted when we talk about the results. And as I noted before, all of our experiments here had an N of 200. So first we'll look at the delta target relatedness, and specifically its effects on memorability and interdependence. So what we're looking at here at the graph, and many of the graphs will look similar to this, is how does the relatedness between the original target and the new target affect the memory's fate? So on the y-axis, what you'll see here is the delta target minus the control recall. So essentially, what this will yield is either a facilitation value in the positive y-axis values, or an interference value in the going into the negatives, for for our memory performance. And we can look at all of this as a function of target relatedness. So for example, what we're looking at here might be the memory for tank maple for the people who saw tank maple and then they saw another similar word pair like tank smart, for example, minus the control condition. So minus memory for tank maple for all those people who didn't see another related pair. So that's essentially what we're looking at on the y-axis here. And then on the x-axis, we're plotting the relationship between maple and smart, so the other words in that pair. So moving to our results, what we see here is essentially no effect, so no interference at those low similarity values. But then when there's high similarity, you're seeing that that facilitates memory for the initial target. So in the example that I just gave, it would facilitate memory for the word maple. Next, what we looked at was the effect on interdependence. So we looked at the dependence between the related pairs like tank maple and tank smart. And if there was a high dependence participant or a high similarity, the two became more interdependent. So essentially, participants would tend to recall both of those pairs, or they would forget both, with increases in similarity between their list 2 pair. Any questions on this? Okay. So next we will turn to the delta Q relatedness. And what we found here were very similar results as well. So here what we're looking at is how relationships between the original and the new Q affect memorability of a pair in the delta Q condition minus the control condition. And what we're seeing here are very similar effects. So as the two Q words become more similar to one another, memorability improves. And again, on the right side over here, the pairs become more dependent. All right, so now moving on to our proactive experiments. So again, going back to Osgood predicted relatedness would benefit memory both retroactively and proactively. So this next set of experiments that we did looked at the proactive interference or facilitation side of things. So essentially here, what we did was virtually the same experiment, except we flipped the order of the supplemental and the base learning because now we were interested in, how does learning those list 2 pairs essentially impact memory for our list 1 pairs? And again, we're still interested in what we're calling here the base pair learning. So those are the ones that you'll see plotted and were our primary interests. But essentially what they did was they would learn the supplemental pairs beforehand so that we could see how it impacted their memory for the base pairs. And again, we have the same conditions, delta target where the target changes, delta Q where the first word in the pair changes, and then the control condition. And then similarly, we have participants test on all the base pairs first, followed by all the supplemental pairs. And we'll also note that we also did this in the reverse order as well to see if that order of testing the supplemental pairs first versus base pairs first made a difference, but it did not. So I'm just going to check the chat for one moment. Oh, okay, great. All right, so
When you need to take questions from Zoom, you'll just have one on. So.
okay, great. Thanks. So now looking at the results for our proactive experience. So similar to our findings from the retroactive study, the relatedness between the targets improved memorability and increased interdependence. So what we're seeing here, and this is a slight difference compared to our results from the retroactive experiments. So in the retroactive experiments, we didn't see any effects at low similarity, but here we were actually seeing interference when there was low similarity. But then we still see facilitation as those targets become more similar. And then similarly, we also see that the relatedness between the targets enhanced interdependence. So they tended to either remember both or forget both. And then finally, looking at our delta Q relatedness, what we found is that delta Q relatedness increased memorability and also increased interdependence. So again, we're seeing these really significant and consistent benefits of relationship of relatedness between the cues for both memorability and interdependence. And again, here, similar to the results that we just showed, we're seeing interference when there's low similarity, but facilitation at high similarity. So what does this all mean, or how are we interpreting what's going on here? So what we're thinking is that when a target and a new target are highly related, even though each one is learned within its own context. So in this graph here, we're depicting that as this L1. So you can think of, we're learning this word pair between the Q target in the context of list 1. When we encounter a new target, or sorry, a new word pair in the context of list 2, even though we're learning them relatively independently, they're reminded of the first pair and both get reactivated, as you can see by that little animation here. So as a result, what we're thinking is happening is that we have this really highly fortified memory trace between all elements of the memory and its context. So it's strengthening their memory and the interdependence, as we saw in the results. But in contrast, when a target and a new target are dissimilar, so for those low similarity values, what we're thinking here when you're learning the list two or the dissimilar pair is that it may only be reactivating that list two set of words. It doesn't reactivate the entire memory trace. And therefore, we're not seeing that strengthening of all elements within this learning experience, but rather they're remaining relatively independent and are subject to interference. So then we also think that something similar is happening in the delta Q condition, such that the high relatedness is allowing for this well-fortified trace and actually enhancing our memory performance for similar material as well, but then low relatedness does not. So all in all, what we're thinking that this shows is that relatedness reduces interference and promotes facilitation both retroactively and proactively, that it promotes interdependence, this tendency to either remember together or forget together, both retroactively and proactively. And our speculation between why this might occur is that the relatedness is increasing our remindings of the prior memory, kind of essentially strengthening and fortifying this entire memory trace, and having this become integrated into a well-fortified network. Great. All right, so now we will turn to the next study.
Okay, so in those prior studies, we showed how related experiences can mutually benefit and come to have linked fates. In the next study, we'll consider how one kind of organizes their recall of a complex relational network, in this case, a nonlinear narrative. So for this, I'll first need to tell you about something called temporal contiguity. If participants learn word lists like at the top of the screen here, their recall patterns reflect temporal contiguity, as in this plot of the conditional response probability of recalling words according to their lag encoding. So this indicates that participants successively recall words experienced nearby in time, with a modest bias to recall events in the forward direction, as in this example. It's also been shown that certain forms of structure can affect this temporal organization. So, for example, participants often cluster together words at recall that were semantically related, as in this example from Per Cederberg and colleagues in 2010, in which the conditional response probability increases with increasing semantic relatedness, and as in the example of grocer, typist, dancer, mustard, carrot, temporal contiguity is then reduced as a result. So what role does temporal contiguity play in recalling naturalistic stimuli? When quantifying its effects in a linear narrative, Heuser and colleagues found evidence for temporal contiguity that appeared a little more forward biased than the typical contiguity result. And similarly, I actually ran a study where people watched and recalled basketball games. And in that case, there was actually a very strong forward bias such that no one ever went backwards in time. So these accentuated forward biases relative to these wordless experiments suggest that with other forms of structure, perhaps like causality, perhaps these affect memory organization in naturalistic contexts. And so in linear narratives where time and causality are actually confounded, kind of moving in the same direction, this begs the question of what things might look like in nonlinear narratives. So in this part of the talk, I'll tell you about experiments performed in collaboration with two undergrads at Cal Poly and Janice Chen at Johns Hopkins. These experiments, we asked, how do structural relationships across parts of a narrative predict memory organization? And which one of them dominate when these are actually in tension? So to do this, we had participants watch Memento, which is a highly nonlinear narrative. If you haven't seen it before or it's been a while, here's its structure. So it actually begins with the very last scene in the chronological story, and then it jumps to the very first scene, and then it jumps back to the second last scene, and then to the second first scene, or towards the beginning, etc. So part of the narrative is going forward, but part of the narrative is going backward, meaning that each time you see a new scene, it ends with the first part of the prior one. Then the narratives meet in the middle for the final scene. So note the tension here already between trying to recall the movie in the presented, like temporal order, which involves sort of jumping across storylines, versus the chronological order, which involves following one part of the storyline all the way through to the last presented scene and then the other one in reverse. We had 3 groups of participants watch and recall the movie. With one, we asked them just recall this in whatever order you can. The next one, we asked to recall it the way it was presented. And then the final one, we asked to try to recall in the chronological order. In order to determine the causal structure, we gave a separate group of pretty devoted participants the task of determining how much, from 1 to 10, each scene influenced each other scene. So on the left, you can see the average of these scores across raters. And from this, we can create a directed network graph with the size of each scene depicted by its average importance, also rated by the same raters, and the connection between the lines, the causality from one scene to the next. So here you can see the forward storyline and the backward storyline pretty nicely separated with the final scene in the center. And the forward storyline is in red and has forward connections like from scene 6 to 8 to 10. Whereas the backward storyline has backward connections like from 9 to 7 to 5. We also used the screenplay, which included detailed descriptions and also dialogue to determine semantic relationships, another possible form of structure. For this, we use semantic similarity based on embeddings from the universal sentence encoder across each pair of scenes. And from this, we can also create a network graph. Note that here and on the last slide, I'm plotting just the top 20% of connections, so the disconnected nodes only appear this way because of the visualization. So first, to learn whether these network properties play any role in memory, we looked at how node degree, or the sum of all connections into and out of a given scene, affected its memorability, or the proportion of participants recalling that scene. In support of their importance, we found that node degree in both the semantic and the causal networks predicted memorability. And further, because the causal network was directed, we could actually separate things into inbound connections or routes to an event from outbound connections or routes from an event. And here we found that the inbound connections and not the outbound ones predicted memory, suggesting that more routes that kind of lead to a memory as you're trying to navigate through a recall predicts memory, but its sort of influencer status on other scenes does not predict it overall. So in order to determine memory organization, or how we transition from scene to scene, here we actually set out to create different transition matrices for how some ideal participants would perform if they were able to follow different strategies perfectly. So in each 2D transition matrix I'm showing, the row is the currently recalled scene, whatever you're recalling right now. And the column is the evidence for each other scene if you were following that strategy. So here are all the strategies. The simplest one is just the presented order one. This is just going to proceed forward in time, plus one scene at every transition, as in the example on the left. Next is the semantic strategy, which involves evidence according to semantic similarity between scenes. Following this is the chronological strategy, which mostly involve these +2 scenes or -2 scene jumps, depending on the storyline. And then after this is the causal network strategy, which involves making predictions based on the average 2D causality matrix. And finally, because participants can actually only ultimately recall one scene given the current one, we created what we're calling the top causal strategy, where we assign the causal strategy scene with the most evidence a value of 1 and all the other scenes a 0. So here I've highlighted in red a sample scene being recalled, here scene 11. And then we looked at the participant's next recalled scene, which in this case I'm highlighting in a little rectangle, scene 7. And we looked at the amount of evidence in that little square for each choice at each transition, which is basically the brightness inside that little square. So for this particular transition, the evidence is strongest for the causal strategy. And just to show one more example, if the participant was then on scene 7 and chose scene 8, that would be strongest evidence for the presented order strategy. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is the big graph. So when we examine the amount of evidence that people take per transition, I'm plotting the experiments independently, but going to focus mostly on the combined result because they're pretty consistent across experiments. So we found that the top causal strategy was strongest in every single experiment, followed by the chronological and causal strategies, followed by the presented order and the semantic ones. So note that there's actually more evidence for the top causal strategy than the presented order strategy, even in experiment 2, when we asked people to try to give it to us in the presented order. So it really seems like in this study, the causal strategy predominated over the temporal representations when you put them really strongly in tension. So in this experiment, we found that event memorability correlated with certain network attributes, both causal and semantic network node degree. And then also, it seems like the inbound connections are more important than the outbound connections. Next, the temporal and the semantic effects in organizing recall, although they can play really strong effects in word lists when there's no other form of structure, it seems like when you put them in tension with other types of strategies, they really get overpowered. So here they were overpowered by the causal structure, and this was the case even when we gave instructions to try to recall in that presented order. It really seems like even the semantic effects are weaker here, and so causality really predominates in certain types of stimuli-like narratives. And finally, we speculate that really time, there's been a lot of kind of models and findings showing that time plays a really strong role in memory. We're not going to deny those. It is obviously a form of structure, but we think it's kind of a weaker form of structure when you're in the presence of more salient structural elements like causality. And ultimately, we think that's a good idea, although a good thing. If your temporal representations were too strong, you might not be able to sort of switch when tasks require to other sort of modes of thinking. Okay, and then finally, one thing that I'm working on a different data set I won't show today, but we speculate that you're really, in order to make this happen, you have to sort of reactivate prior neural states when you see something new that wasn't related to what you were just looking at. And that helps to kind of bridge the events in time. And so when it comes to doing recall, you can actually recall those things together, even though they weren't presented together. All right, so for the last study I'm going to talk about, we're going to turn to a different type of media that we will carve up in a different kind of way. So rather than creating relational structures, we're going to examine how the latent variable of surprise predicts memory across timescales. Yeah, sure.
I'll unmute. Hopefully people can hear me. I'm asking questions. So I was thinking, so back to the previous discussion slide. So you speculate time is a weak form of structure in the presence is that without more salient structure elements or with more structure?
With more salient structural elements.
So then time is not it becomes weaker because there's more salient
in
stuff
terms of
going
like
on.
how it's manifested, in terms of like how it's predicting recall.
Yeah, I see. And so if you're just like, so back to like the initial example Kelly was giving of like learning two things that aren't like would time still be like at a certain point is there no is there no tie between the like I guess it'd be more of like a similarity of like what you're learning then at that point. That's back to like kind of Kelly's experiment, in which they're not really linked, except for how similar the information is that you're processing.
Right. So so in those experiments, like they were learned as different contexts and at least several minutes apart. So would require bringing something back. And then it does seem like like in a high similarity case, it's like because you've seen a word pair that's really similar to this, back to that and like, oh, now we're doing, now we're doing tank oak and not tank maple, let's say.
Gotcha. All right. I think I needed extra second to process. All makes sense.
I mean, I think time also is playing a role there too. Like if you had people learn, months apart, they might not be able to bring that thing back to mind and couldn't integrate them too. So having them be somewhat close in time helps you to do that integration. For this, I'm really talking about how, how well something being learned successively is helping you organize it. And really, in a lot of cases, like you talk about a vacation, you talk about what you learned in class, because things do typically follow this like linear order, you'll probably also follow a temporal order. So kind of the point of this experiment was to pull those apart and like put them in tension with the memento example. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, just think about it. So then with time, I don't like, so would, because it's very compelling, and I just want to make sure I'm fully understanding. Would time potentially be stronger than if there are fewer causal elements?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think like if you take when I was talking about temporal contiguity at the beginning, a lot of those are like word list experiments where the point of the way that to present the stimuli is to have no other form of structure, really. It's like totally random words presented. And so as a participant, that's a very hard thing to do. And so you kind of rely on that form of structure, like, okay, I'm going to try to rehearse them in order and like think about them in order because there's no other real way to do it well.
Well, and then it takes you back to like, why did we evolve to do it that way? And it seems like we probably evolved to do it that way. Like, we probably evolved to think about things in a time way
Yes.
initially because it makes sense causally.
Yeah, and I think once we're like we have the machinery there to encode things by time. Like there's kind of at least the way I interpret a lot of the results from like Mark Howard and others, like there's this kind of slowly drifting context that helps you to link things via time. But when there's like also these sudden shifts, like as you're jumping across the different narratives in Memento, there's probably some bleed over there that's like, oh, my temporal representation, it hasn't changed entirely. But you're kind of because the task calls for a stronger shift, then you've kind of reduced, I guess, the importance of that temporal element. So yeah, I think it's like a mix of all these things. Yeah, cool. All right. So changing directions a little bit, and for the final study, do we have to be done at a particular time? Okay. All right, so to preview this study, we know that as events are unfolding over time, we're often updating our predictions about upcoming events and affective states. And it's often when you face errors in these predictions or surprises that drives the perceived segmentation of events and also tends to benefit memory. So here we're going to examine predictions and prediction errors in the context of sports games. And I will argue that predictions really play a huge role in sports. To show you this, here's the probability charted over time that two different college basketball teams, Florida and Gonzaga, will win a particular exciting game. You can see that this win probability shown in red is going to swing wildly back and forth. And as a fan, these swings are really a big part of the excitement of a game. And I think I can convince you by showing you a very unexciting game, which is between two teams where one basically had a 95% chance of winning going into the game. They were a much stronger team. They started to blow the other team out. Typically, what you get is people leaving the stadium or just starting to tune out of the game. And so basically, this is an example where you are forming predictions and it's just becoming more and more certain. And you don't even feel like you need to watch the game anymore. So there's a couple advantages to using sports for this kind of research. There's really an explosion of publicly available data. There's every single play in like national sports games are posted out there online that you can kind of analyze and mine really easily. The betting odds are also published. And so this allows you to kind of align people's memories with something quantifiable, a quantifiable prediction metric. And then there's also a hierarchy of timescales. So you might watch a game, but within that, there's a lot of different plays. But games also occur within seasons. And so there's a lot of different timescales over which you can answer questions about memory. And then sports moments are really highly emotional and vivid for fans. Elizabeth Kensinger did great work along these lines. And so this has also been shown that like people really, if you're a sports fan, many of these memories are like pivotal or like really core to your life. And so what that's allowing you to do as a researcher is like find a readily accessible memory where you know when it happened in time, And even if it's been a long time since the memory was formed, these can really endure, and you can identify the events. So I just wanted to highlight very quickly, a prior study that I did that kind of led into this one. So I ran a study a few years ago where I had people watch basketball games in the fMRI scanner. And underlying each of these games, we created a win probability metric that based on like when teams scored or turned the ball over, the win probability changed. And so each time there was a change, we said that's a certain amount of surprise. That's just an absolute value based on the size of the change. And what we found here is that while people were trying to recall these events later on, if we look at the memorability of each scene, the amount of surprise at the end of the possession significantly correlated with the likelihood that they would remember that possession. Now, to lead into this study, all those prior findings relate to what I'm calling momentary surprise, but I just talked about sports having this hierarchy of timescales. Plays occur within games, within seasons, and we can make predictions over each of these timescales. You can say, hey, who do you think is going to win the game? Or who do you think is going to win the title this year? So what about surprise that unfolds over a longer timescale? So I'm going to introduce this concept of long-term multi-event surprise. Before that, we worked on this project with two undergrads at Cal Poly, as well as Alex Barnett from the University of Toronto. And to intro to this concept, I'm going to use an example of Bernie Sanders' likelihood of winning the 2020 primary, which feels like a quaint, wonderful time long ago. But once upon a time, he actually had a 25% chance in late January of 2020 of winning the Democratic primary, according to the website 538. And let's say in this example that over the course of many more primaries, he won state after state, and he actually had a 98% chance of locking up the nomination. So then the question is, if he locked up the nomination the next week, and basically had a 100% chance of winning the primary, or he locked it up, is that surprising? So the answer here really depends on the timescale. From the perspective of the end of March, it was only a 2% change. You might have thought that was a foregone conclusion. But from January, there's a 75% change. And so this is what I mean when I refer to long-term and multi-event surprise. By long-term, I mean it spans more than one moment or longer than working memory. And by multi-event, I mean there's more than one state change, if you will, between some initial prediction and the final outcome. So you can actually look across these different timescales. So we asked sports fans, tell us your most positive and your most negative memory of a single play, a single game, or a single season from your life. Sorry, not just sports, but basketball fans specifically. So these are all examples of each of those three things. People were able to do this. We also asked them to choose different seasons for the plays, games, and seasons, so they weren't just saying the same thing. And then those heroic RAs that I talked about before would go in and try to identify the exact plays or games or seasons, those are easier, that these occurred. And then we could look this up and align it with our win probability metrics. So to align the play responses with surprise values, this is one example play. We have basically this big, huge metric of millions of play-by-play events. And we're able to identify the moment that something happened, the win probability at the time, and then the win probability at the next moment. So in this example, there was a surprise value of basically 0.26. And then I'll show you how we compute the other levels of surprise. So first, the effect of surprise on plays. Just like in the prior study I did, we found that both positive and negative plays were more surprising than like a null distribution on all plays in all basketball games. Next, we thought maybe this wasn't a very fair comparison because fans don't even necessarily watch every part of every basketball game. But we found that this holds even if you're only choosing plays from the fourth quarter of the games that they actually reported. And so it really seems like these play memories are sticking with people more so than, sorry, these surprising memories are sticking with people more so than the average play. Just to show you, if we look at this in a signed direction, the positive ones are more positive for given the team that they were cheering for, and the negative ones were more negative than given the team they're cheering for. So all very expected. But now let's look at these other levels. So what about the effects of surprise on game memories? So for this, I came up with two metrics, or we came up with two metrics to quantify what are game level types of surprise that span at least more than one moment. So the most obvious one is full game surprise. This is basically if somebody talks about a shocking upset, what they're really referring to is the difference between the pre-game probability and the outcome. So basically, we just took those two values and we computed how surprising each game was. The other thing we could look at is within game surprise. So this is like basically the effect of a comeback. So we looked at which team ended up winning the game, and then we looked at their least likely win probability within that game. So some games don't end up as much of a comeback just because there might not be that much variability within the game. But in this case, there was an 84 or 0.84 value of surprise. And here we also wanted to control and make sure that there wasn't just momentary play surprises that kind of fed into that. So for each one of these games, we found the highest surprise for a given play in the game and asked, could that explain the game surprise instead? So here we actually found that negative but not positive game memories were biased by surprise. And this is the case over on the left here, looking at the full game surprise. And then also over on the right when we looked at within game surprise or the comeback effect. So there was not an effect of positive memories here. We think that this probably occurred because many teams were reporting their favorite game as the game when their favorite team like won a championship, like that final game 7 or whatever. And in many cases, they already had like a high likelihood of winning that game. So it wasn't necessarily that they felt so much joy about the events of that game, but like because of what it meant for winning the championship. So that's what we kind of speculated. In both of these effects, we controlled for the maximum play surprise. We reran the analyses in a way that controlled for that, and both of these effects stood. And finally, let's look at season level surprise and season level memories. So for this, we turned to a different metric. We looked at the Vegas championship odds. So basically, if you follow a sports team long enough, you can bet on their likelihood of winning a title anytime over the course of months throughout the season, and then increasingly throughout the playoffs. So this is basically the likelihood that the Toronto Raptors would win a championship the year that they did in 2019. And you can get a value of full season surprise, which is basically the final outcome versus the likelihood that they had of winning that championship before the season. Similarly, you can look at within season surprise, which is you can look at the furthest they were away from winning that championship against their final outcome. And then as a final outcome, we basically ranked all the teams. So in this case, the Toronto Raptors would be number 1. The team that they beat in the finals would be number 2, and everyone else in decreasing rank in terms of how well their season went. And then finally, we had control analyses here looking at the maximum game and the maximum play surprise from the chosen seasons as well. So we're really trying to make sure that something is happening at this broader level that can't be explained at a smaller level or a lower level. So here, what I'm plotting is actually the likelihood of winning the championship on the x-axis and how well that predicted season success. So overall, this does predict season success. People do know which teams are going to generally be better, but the correlation only explains 38% of the variance. So it could also be a lot better. And within that, we can plot a line through the middle and say on the lower left, these are seasons that turned out better than expected. In the upper right, they were worse than expected. And for the blue memories, the positive ones, you can see a lot of those are on this better than expected side and vice versa for the red memories. And that's indeed what we find if we quantify them. So the positive memories tend to be better than expected. The negative ones were worse than expected. And in fact, if we don't look at this expectation, the worst memories are right about where expectations are. So it really, or sorry, right about in an average season. So it really is because people had this positive expectation and they fell away from that, that seems to lead to these negative memories. Very similar results if we look at within season surprise. I'll move through this quickly. There's better than expected and worse than expected. And similarly, both of these go in opposite directions. And this effect and the prior one both hold if we look at the maximum play and game surprise over the whole season, which was a fun for loop to run. But basically, these effects hold looking at these lower values. So in some, it looks like we found that surprise had effects on memories for plays, games, only in the negative case for games, and for seasons. So here, just as a recap, we collected fans' most positive and negative memories for these 3 different levels. We showed that unsigned surprise biased positive memories for plays and seasons, and then negative memories for all 3 of the levels. The play data replicates the lab findings that I talked about really briefly at the beginning and sort of extends them into autobiographical realm, the real world realm. And then the game and season data show that there's evidence that there's this effect of long-term multi-event surprise that at least seems to correlate with memory, and it can't be explained at shorter timescales. So we just wanted to speculate a little bit about what this might mean, or what the mechanisms might be. It could be that we hold some lingering trace, not just of all the prior events, as in like the prior games in a season, but also the prior predictions that we had in that season. And so if our team's doing much better than expected, then we're going to have a much better memory. Whereas if we knew we had good expectations going into the year, like most Boston sports teams can have almost every year, then there isn't quite as much room for positive surprise. So we speculate that this could be the hippocampus could be actually kind of caching these prior predictions, and these are compared against later outcomes, perhaps with longer related events like the games within the Raptors 2019 season, included in some agglomerated fashion where you kind of keep updating the memory throughout the year. But again, that's a little bit speculative. Okay, so with this final study, we showed that surprise across these different timescales can predict memory. So to wrap up the talk, we thought we'd highlight just a few themes that emerge across the work. In the word pair and the memento studies, we examined how memory endurance relies on building up these cognitive structures based on semantic factors, causal factors, and temporal factors. In the memento and basketball studies, we looked for new ways to kind of carve up nature at its joints and find novel ways to measure these latent variables like causality and surprise, and measure their impact on subsequent memory. And finally, across all the studies, we hope we've demonstrated some of the ways that we can bridge knowledge from studies employing simple associations and move towards capturing memory for the complexity of these real-world experiences, such as Callie's graduate school experiences and our couple's trips to Boston. So with that, we'd like to thank our student and other co-authors, funding sources, and you for your attention. Thanks.